Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Dan Baer, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy Research here. It's a pleasure to have everyone here today for a really important conversation about, and to see some old friends, for a really important conversation about America's nuclear strategy. Our speaker today is John Feiner, the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor, who has been a colleague and friend for many years. We first met in the Obama administration. Before he served in the Obama administration, which he came into as a White House fellow, he was a journalist for the Washington Post. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about John is the way that he never left behind his time as a journalist and his understanding of the way that foreign policy has an impact on real people in real places around the world. I have often said that if I had a moral proxy in this administration, I would choose John Feiner as the person who I would give my vote to. John has served in the State Department as Secretary Kerry's Chief of Staff, and then in this administration for all 4 years as the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor to Jake Sullivan. The conversation that we're having today is one that certainly I wouldn't have predicted when I was a much younger person. I think those of us who lived through, at an early age, the end of the Cold War thought that the height of nuclear danger was behind us. And the fact that we are living in a moment of arguably the most significant nuclear risk in my lifetime is something that I might not have even predicted 10 years ago. But the expansion of China's nuclear arsenal, as well as Russia's recent experimentation and breaching of taboos, experimentation with nuclear blackmail has really heightened attention and the danger that nuclear weapons pose. The United States has, this National Security Council has both said that, in shorter words, bigger isn't necessarily better in terms of a nuclear arsenal and protecting deterrence, but also recognized increasingly that in order to maintain deterrence, they believe that we may need to expand our nuclear arsenal, obviously at great cost and also with great care. The National Security Council has played a key role in defining our nuclear strategy over the last few years, and we are honored and delighted to have John Feiner here today to give an address, which will be followed by a panel discussion on how the administration sees it as the administration winds down. John, welcome.
Hey, everybody, and I should start off by apologizing for being a few minutes late. One of the things I will not miss when I finally do leave the White House will be the fact that my schedule is so subject to other forces beyond my control. But it's great to be here with all of you, and I really want to say, before I start, a big thank you to Dan, both for the kind words, for the advice and wisdom that you have lobbed over the transom throughout this administration to help keep us on course and for being a great friend for so many years. I also want to thank Daryl at the Arms Control Association and James here at Carnegie, both for helping convene this, but also much more importantly for the work that you all do every day to advance security here at home and around the world, and that you've done now for many years. Most importantly, I want to thank everybody for indulging my saying a few words about where we are on these issues that are of such great consequence and concern to all of us. I want to talk about the rapid developments we've seen in weapons of mass destruction issues over the last 4 years and how we've adapted our policies to respond to those developments, as well as the work that still lies ahead, because it is on all of us, the public and private sectors, Democrats, Republicans, to ensure that we stay on a secure and stable path. One thing that may look different from the recent past, where we enjoyed open bilateral cooperation with our Cold War adversaries to dramatically shrink nuclear arsenals, and a path that nonetheless helps us achieve the same goals we've always had: reducing nuclear risks, strengthening nonproliferation, enhancing strategic stability, and pursuing a peaceful, secure world free from nuclear weapons. And really, our collective focus should boil down to a few key areas, since mercifully it is not the entire world for whom these weapons issues are directly relevant. I want to start with Russia, where we've seen some of the most dramatic nuclear developments, especially since the brutal invasion of Ukraine. We've seen Russian officials, up to and including President Putin himself, brazenly threaten nuclear escalation on the battlefield. suspend implementation of data exchanges and inspections that lie at the heart of the New START Treaty, very publicly revise Russian nuclear doctrine in reaction to Western security assistance, announce the movement of nuclear weapons into Belarus, launch a conventionally armed intermediate-range ballistic missile to spread fear across Europe and throughout Ukraine. And we've seen Russia develop a nuclear weapon intended to be placed into orbit, risking the peaceful use of space by the entire world. These threats have begun to erode the post-Cold War arms control foundation that all U.S. administrations have tried to protect, and we take them seriously. But make no mistake, Russia's nuclear threats come from a place of weakness, not from strength, and that matters. Here's why. Russia's conventional forces have proven to be far less effective during this war in Ukraine than anyone expected. Anyone inside the government, anyone outside the government. Russia's conventional forces, as you've seen, and the result of that is that President Putin has tried to compensate by saber rattling, by relying on nuclear threats, by recklessly using strategic stability as just another chip in this war. In reaction, we've acted responsibly, coordinating with allies and refusing to respond in kind, and we've made it clear again and again to Russia and to any other adversary watching that Moscow's nuclear threats have not and will not deter us from supporting Ukraine. We've also made it clear that we're ready to have a dialogue and to manage nuclear risks, because that's the responsible thing for nuclear weapon states to do. Within a few months of taking office, President Biden implemented a 5-year extension of the New START Treaty. Just months after Russia invaded Ukraine, he reiterated our willingness, publicly and privately, to negotiate a new framework to follow the treaty. And every month since, President Biden has made it clear that we're ready to discuss strategic arms control measures without preconditions. As everyone in this room knows well, this is not some far-fetched idea. Just a decade ago, Russia was willing to compartmentalize issues pertaining to nuclear deterrence, even if we couldn't coordinate on anything else. Russia still found ways to discuss nuclear risks, even if our bilateral tensions were high. Simply put, Russia is no longer willing to come to the table. They have decided to cut ties in our arms control relationship. Now, that does not mean we will stop trying or have stopped trying, but it does mean that we have to be clear-eyed that we are in a new era, one that demands new strategies to achieve the same goals we have always had: preventing an arms race, reducing the risk of misperception and escalation, and ensuring the safety and security of our people and the world from nuclear threats. That's why we've invested in modernizing our deterrent capabilities, following through on the past 2 administrations' core efforts while taking some additional steps, including pursuing a modern variant of the B-61 gravity bomb, the B-61-13. We've also advanced plans to develop and deploy conventional long-range missiles to strengthen deterrence and defense in both the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. And we've made clear that we're prepared to take further steps to augment our posture if Russia continues to violate New START and refuses to engage. At the same time, we've also advanced new risk reduction and accountability measures. For example, we enacted lawful, proportionate, and reversible countermeasures, including suspending our data sharing and notifications to Russia to ensure that Moscow would not garner advantage by suspending the New START Treaty. As my colleague Jake Sullivan told this group last year, these actions are 2 sides of the same proverbial nuclear coin. Responsibly enhancing our deterrent capabilities enables us to negotiate arms control measures from a position of strength. And arms control measures help limit and shape our adversaries' decisions on nuclear capabilities. Now, in addition to Russia's nuclear threats, we've also seen increased cooperation with other countries, including with the DPRK, which I'd like to talk about next. North Korea has taken increasingly escalatory actions on the peninsula, from disregarding the Inter-Korean Comprehensive Military Agreement to increasing missile tests to firing rounds toward the south along the maritime border with the ROK. More recently, we've seen DPRK troops fighting and dying in Russia's unjust war against the people of Ukraine, the DPRK's first ever expeditionary mission. And even further, the 2 recently concluded a treaty to turbocharge their cooperation, including the possibility of Russian support to the DPRK in technical areas like nuclear energy and space programs. Now, throughout all of this, the United States has made clear that we stand ready, like we always are, to engage in dialogue with the DPRK without preconditions. And while we certainly seek to address the topic of denuclearization, there are a number of other matters that our administration has communicated an openness to discussing, including interim steps toward that goal and military deconfliction. However, the DPRK has refused to engage on any topic, again and again. So in the face of these increasing threats and the lack of any willingness to engage in dialogue, our team has worked closely with our allies and partners to fundamentally enhance our extended deterrence relationships. For example, under President Biden's leadership, we have elevated our nuclear and non-nuclear regional deterrence cooperation with the ROK in Japan, including establishing the first ever leader-level U.S. ROK Japan trilat. We're also working closely with our partners to modernize our approach to the missile technology control regime. Our team is currently finalizing a national security memorandum on missile technology exports that will help us achieve that goal. This leads to the next issue I want to discuss, which is Iran. Over the last few years, we've seen dramatic developments in Iran's nuclear program. When we came into office, this administration, Iran's nuclear program was unconstrained. A result, as everyone here knows, of the previous administration's departure from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, which had put strict limits on Tehran's nuclear development. Over the next years that followed, Iran irresponsibly overplayed its hand. They would engage only through highly ineffective, indirect talks and pushed for unrealistic concessions that prevented a new deal from being reached. Ultimately, Iran then walked away from the negotiating table altogether and began operating more advanced centrifuges and enriching more uranium. And over the last year, there's been another shift. Since Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th, we've seen Iran's two primary regional deterrent capabilities, proxies like the Assad regime, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and an expanded ballistic missile force, either significantly degraded or less effective than originally thought. Together with our partners and allies, the United States military worked closely with Israeli defense forces to defeat unprecedented Iranian aerial attacks twice. The United States also helped set the conditions for Israel to dramatically reduce the threat of Iran's proxies. Now, all of that is good news. But at the same time, Iran's weakened position has led voices inside Iran to call for changes to its nuclear posture and policy. I want to be clear, we do not assess that Iran has decided to build or acquire or pursue a nuclear weapon. And the United States remains committed to ensuring that will always be the case through whatever means necessary. But taken together, all of these new developments demand a new approach. We have to manage the risk and seize the potential diplomatic opportunity here. We have laid the groundwork in the Biden administration. Iran has never been weaker in the modern period and in more need of economic relief. And we have put the next administration in the strongest possible position to strike a deal that would leave the United States, our partners, and the world in a safer, more secure position. Now, for many of us, those three nations have been the biggest nuclear risks we have faced: Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But we now see other nations causing just as significant cracks in the nuclear foundation. The People's Republic of China is at the top of that list. Since day one of this administration, President Biden has made it clear that our two countries are in competition, and it's critically important to manage that competition responsibly so that it does not veer into conflict. That includes responsibly managing issues related to strategic deterrence. As stated by the Bipartisan Congressional Strategic Posture Commission, and I'll quote from them, China is pursuing a nuclear force buildup on a scale and pace unseen since the U.S.-Soviet nuclear arms race. This is not only reckless, it's contradictory to the PRC's purported retention of what they call an assured retaliation strategy and a no first use policy. So we've made it clear to China at every level that reducing nuclear risks through arms control measures is in our shared interest. We've raised these issues bilaterally, and we've done so multilaterally, including in the P5 format. And we've seen some progress. After refusals to engage for nearly 2 years, President Biden's Woodside Summit with President Xi made progress on a number of key areas between the United States and the PRC, including the resumption of military-to-military communications. This fall, our two nations also provided reciprocal ICBM launch notifications, which is a common practice for us with Russia and many other countries, but was the first time China and the United States had taken this step. And last month, President Biden and President Xi affirmed the need to maintain human control over the decision to use nuclear weapons, a breakthrough in our discussions on safety and risk related to AI. Now, these steps are not close to the New START-style arms control measures that would give us more predictability with China. And it's not a resumption of the arms control dialogue that China abruptly canceled last year. But they are straightforward, common sense, nuclear risk reduction steps that could open the door to more cooperation down the line, including fuller arms control measures and launch notification agreements. And in the meantime, we've adapted our nuclear strategy and planning to account for China's buildup and the need to deter multiple nuclear-armed adversaries simultaneously. Now, I do promise that this should be a dialogue and not a monologue, but before I wrap up, I want to address one more question that I think is on many minds right now, which is where all of this is going to go from here. And by that I mean, what is our team going to focus on as we enter our last month in office, and what is likely to be at the top of the agenda for the next administration when it takes the baton? We see a few things. First, Syria. The fall of the Assad regime provides an historic opportunity to turn the page on a brutal period of Syria's history and to forge a better future, one free from the threat of chemical weapons, among many other things. President Biden has directed our team to make this a priority, and in the weeks ahead, we will work with Syrian officials and international organizations like the OPCW to find, secure, and dispose of any WMD materials. That includes any nuclear, radiological, biological, or chemical weapons material. And we will work side by side with other countries, including our friends in the region, on this critical mission. As many of you know, the United States began a substantial campaign to remove and eliminate Syria's declared chemical weapons stockpile beginning in 2013. As a result of that campaign, Syria's declared stockpile of approximately 1,200 munitions and 1,300 tons of chemical precursors and agents were destroyed. But the Assad regime retained an undeclared stockpile and brazenly used other chemicals, such as chlorine, as weapons of war in violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. We understand that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and the new Syrian caretaker government are committed to working with the international community to remove and eliminate these remaining legacies of a brutal dictatorship. We urge them to do so, and the United States is committed to this as well. Alongside our allies and partners, we stand ready to assist with that effort. Next, Pakistan. Recently, Pakistan has developed increasingly sophisticated missile technology, from long-range ballistic missile systems to equipment that would enable the testing of significantly larger rocket motors. If these trend lines continue, Pakistan will have the capability to strike targets well beyond South Asia, including in the United States, raising real questions about Pakistan's intentions. The list of countries that possess both nuclear weapons and the missile capability to directly reach the U.S. homeland is very small, and they tend to be adversarial towards the United States: Russia, North Korea, and China. So candidly, it's hard for us to see Pakistan's actions as anything other than an emerging threat to the United States. Now, leaders across our administration, myself included, have raised these concerns repeatedly with senior Pakistani officials. We have been a longtime partner with Pakistan on development, on counterterrorism, and other security issues, including quite sensitive issues. We've provided support to Islamabad during difficult times, and we continue to desire a cooperative relationship in these areas of shared interest. That makes us question even more why Pakistan will be motivated to develop a capability that could be used against us. Unfortunately, it is our sense that Pakistan has failed to take these concerns, and frankly the concerns of others in the international community, seriously, and continues to advance these capabilities. As a result, the Biden administration has implemented a series of steps to contend with further development of long-range missile systems. Over the last year, we've issued 3 rounds of sanctions against non-Pakistani entities that have provided support to Pakistan's ballistic missile program. And yesterday, we issued sanctions directly against Pakistan's state-owned National Development Complex, which the United States assesses is involved in the development and production of Pakistan's long-range ballistic missiles. The first time we have sanctioned a Pakistani state-owned enterprise tied to missile development. Simply put, we're going to keep the pressure on Pakistan regarding its long-range missile program, even as we also continue to seek diplomatic resolutions to address our concerns. and we encourage every other nation to do the same. Finally, as we focus on these emerging issues, we cannot and will not take our eye off the ball of persistent arms control challenges, of ensuring America continues to lead the world on this front. And we will encourage the next administration to do the same. Because as everyone in this room knows well, this is a bipartisan issue, always has been. It is in all of our interests to ensure that our nation prioritizes arms control and reduces WMD risks across the world. In practice, that means continuing to pursue new talks with the DPRK and expanding talks with China to limit nuclear arms, even as we continue to modernize our nuclear forces. It means taking advantage of what has been a strategic realignment in the Middle East to reach diplomatic constraints on Iran's nuclear program, even as we continue to increase the pressure. It means forging international norms on emerging challenges like artificial intelligence and space security. And it means working to revive arms control measures with Russia, even as we continue to stand up for Ukraine with our allies and our partners. In particular, the next administration will have the opportunity to negotiate with Russia before New START expires in February 2026, and will have significant leverage based on President Biden's work on nuclear modernization. I'll close with this. The United States is committed to seeking greater stability and security and the long-term goal of a world free from nuclear weapons, no matter how divided and how challenging the world may be. And I'm proud of the work this administration has done over the last 4 years to lay groundwork for this new era we are in. The 6 issues that I laid out are evidence of a new security environment that must change how we think about nonproliferation and arms control. We can't expect all countries to reflexively engage in cooperation on WMD issues anymore. We have to create incentives, positive and negative, to encourage participation in negotiation and strengthen our hand within these negotiations. We have to improve our defensive capabilities and our allies' capabilities to show that adversaries will not gain an advantage simply by refusing to engage. And we have to remain open to diplomacy and nimble enough to strike deals when the opportunity arises that serve our interests. This balanced approach is fundamentally bipartisan, it is fundamentally common sense, and it is fundamentally in America's interest and in the world's interest. I'm hopeful that the next administration will continue it. I'm grateful to all of you who have helped our nation uphold it for generations, and I'm grateful for all of you for having me today, and I look forward to the rest of this conversation. Thank you. Do you want to sit right here? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, John, for joining us. I'm Darrell Kimball, Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, and co-hosting this discussion with John Feiner and our follow-up panel. So thank you very much for joining us. While you're busy, your schedule is still very busy. That's a lot to unpack. We're going to be taking a few questions from the audience. Use that QR code. I will try to be keeping track of some of the ones that come in. But first, John, let me pick up on one of the things you spoke about at the end with the emphasis on the importance of arms control and nuclear risk reduction being a key part of U.S. national security policy going forward. As you noted, Russia has shut down the dialogue on risk reduction and arms control since the invasion, and that leaves few practical options to negotiate what the president talked about in earlier, and Jake Sullivan in 2023, a new framework, a formal framework. Few options other than maybe an informal agreement with Russia not to exceed New START. And then at the same time, as you know, there are some here in the United States who are beginning to argue that the U.S. should not only modernize the existing arsenal, build up the force beyond New START levels. And there are others who have argued that that creates some significant risks, a dangerous three-way arms race, building up forces for the first time, the U.S. and Russia, in 35 years. So from the Biden administration's perspective, your perspective, I mean, if you could just lay out, given the landscape you talked about, I mean, what are the risks of failure going forward in the future to not to have effective limits on the most dangerous weapons? We're looking at nuclear weapons in particular.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. Look, the risks are obvious. for generations now, we have collectively put the risk of nuclear war at the very top of the list of things to avoid in the world for people who are managing global security and national security. The reality is, the end of an administration is not the time to roll out or muse about in a forum like this, a new doctrinal approach or thoughts on kind of the numerical aspects of our policy. I suspect you will see an early statement along those lines from the new administration in its nuclear posture review, the way you got one from our administration early on in the Biden years. And the reality is, I think we have been quite clear that we don't, just see this issue as a pure numerical calculus, a pure equation. X country has Y number, therefore the U.S. must have Z number. Mm-hmm. Not nearly that simple. That said, I think we've also been quite clear that if these trends continue to move in a negative direction, if countries, and China is the one I focused on, but there are others of great concern, continue to move in the direction of increasing stockpiles and deployed numbers, there may come a moment when changes in deployment on the side of the United States would only be, not only be rational, but necessary. But I will leave it to the next administration to lay out its approach to these challenges. The stakes are incredibly high. I think there's probably never been a time when there were more countries moving in concerning direction and frankly less dialogue among them about how to put constraints on that. And that is not a good thing.
Not a good thing, I would agree. And so on the question of how many nuclear weapons are enough, I mean, the Biden administration just completed a nuclear weapons deployment guidance document, which follows on from the 2022 nuclear posture review. And in that review, one of the things that it says, and you said this in your remarks, President Biden directed that the United States be able to deter multiple adversaries. And some have suggested that China's buildup means that the United States needs to increase the force, begin to prepare to increase the force to fight a nuclear war with two nuclear adversaries at the same time if necessary. So, help us understand the words and the meaning, if you can, regarding the nuclear weapons employment guidance document. Does that mean that the president has determined, at least for its administration, that U.S. nuclear forces are not required to limit the damage from attacks from multiple countries at the same time? Or is it to deter? In other words, do more nuclear adversaries with more nuclear weapons require that we have to cover all of the targets that could possibly hit back at the United States in a war that involves these countries at the same time?
So look, I'm not going to parse the implications of this in much more detail than I have already, or than is laid out in the 491 report, which is the unclassified reflections on the employment guidance, which I'm sure you're extremely familiar with, and which have been submitted to Congress. What I will say is, sitting here today, we fundamentally believe that the strength and adequacy of our nuclear deterrent is sound and strong. A new administration is going to come in, make its own assessment, issue its own statements with regard to doctrine, its own nuclear employment guidance. You've seen what this administration has done and what we've put on the record, and I'm not going to elaborate much beyond that.
Okay. Just a technical note, Mackenzie, I'm not seeing the questions coming up in the iPad, so if you could. Pardon?
I have one now.
Okay. Folks, we have a gentleman here who's willing to take your questions from the U.S. government. Please forward those questions. So let me just follow up on one of the things you discussed at the very end that relates to the current situation in Syria, that the U.S. is going to be working with the OPCW, other governments who are now working to assist HTS in the rather uncertain situation. I mean, what can you tell us about what exactly is being done to help figure out whether the capabilities have been degraded, removed, et cetera? How long might that take? I mean, what more can you tell us? And when will we be hearing more about this from the OPCW or from the Security Council or the U.S. government?
So I'd say a few things. One, taking a step back, I think any conversation about the situation involving chemical weapons inside Syria has to start with what I mentioned in my remarks, which is how much worse off we would all be if there were 1,300 more tons of chemical weapons and precursors present inside Syria, and a diplomatic engagement by the United States in 2013 in the Obama administration is responsible for removing those weapons and dramatically reducing that threat, but not eliminating it for all the reasons that I described and that you know well. And so we are now in the early days of this revolutionary change in governance in Syria. The security environment is complicated, to say the least. I think we and other international partners are working through exactly when and where and how to engage the new authorities inside Syria, and that goes for the international organizations as well. But everything I have heard suggests both HTS and the other groups that now have responsibility in Syria are leaning in terms of their willingness to engage both us and international organizations in particular on this issue, and I suspect you will see developments, including developments on the ground soon. But let's keep in mind, I mean, this is still a complicated security environment for anyone to operate and still early days.
Right. No, I would agree that if the larger Syrian arsenal that was there before 2013 was still present today, this would be a radically different situation, much more dangerous. We've got a question in from the audience on your comments about Pakistan's motivation for developing longer range capabilities. I mean, if you can tell us, I mean, what is the thinking of the Biden administration about why Pakistan might want to seek these longer range capabilities, possibly including the United States? It is a new development in Pakistan's nuclear program, but what might some of the reasons be for this?
So I'm not going to speculate on motivations. I would actually very much encourage those in conversation with Pakistani officials to ask those questions themselves, the way others have asked those questions pretty directly. What I can say is just looking at a map and looking at ranges, you know, we believe that this is fundamentally focused on us. And I think that is an inescapable conclusion based on the information that we've got. And that is why this is of such great concern, because the United States will not simply sit back and watch the development of this capability that we believe could pose a threat ultimately down the road.
There's another question about the new report from the Defense Department about China's nuclear modernization program. It reports, as I recall from reading yesterday, that the force is estimated to be 600 total. But one thing that it did not say this time around is it did not estimate with confidence that China would be increasing its arsenal to 1,500 by 2035. What does that suggest, if anything, about what China is intending to do? And then the other question we have here is, do you see value in engaging with China on some of its proposals regarding nuclear postures, specifically its proposal for a joint no first use arrangement? Would just engaging with China on that discussion be useful in the future?
So I guess I'd say a few things. One is whatever the ultimate number that China is seeking, it has already reached a level that has fundamentally changed the strategic environment and therefore is worthy of deeper engagement, deeper conversation among nuclear countries in the world, including the United States, and that's why we've sought those conversations directly with the PRC. In terms of what would actually be the agenda of a constructive set of conversations, I don't think we have put limits or constraints on the topics. I think we would be willing to engage and discuss broadly. It doesn't mean we would come in and change our position on some of these issues, but it has not been we have leaned in. It has been the United States' desire to enter into deeper conversations on these issues of risk reduction and ultimately strategic stability with the PRC, and I think we have made some progress, and I hope it continues into the new administration.
All right, and there's one other China-Russia arms control discussions related question. The previous administration, the first Trump administration, attempted in 2020 for a trilateral discussion. The Biden administration has pursued a discussions on a bilateral basis with Russia and with China, with limited success with China, as you mentioned. I mean, what have you learned about why that's the useful way to go? We keep hearing at the Arms Control Association questions about a trilateral framework. If you could just elaborate on what has been learned through this process over the last 4 years?
I guess what I'd say about this is these are very different countries, very different contexts, very different capabilities, and I think different doctrines within those countries. And so our sense has been it is better, more likely to be constructive and ultimately successful to pursue those conversations bilaterally. That is the approach that we have sought in this administration. And again, we've made, I think, some modest progress with one of them and taken a number of significant steps back because of Russian policy, not ours, with the other.
All right. I think we got time maybe for a couple more questions and one more question. Well, why don't we end on this one? And I promise you this is not one that we planted in the audience as an NGO, but the question is, given that arms control has become more technocratic, technical, what role do you think the public and non-governmental organizations can play in generating the support necessary for de-escalation, halting and reversing arms competition going forward in the future?
I mean, look, I think we inside the U.S. government have always maintained a very constructive relationship with the expert community outside the government, some of whom have had previous government service, others who have just studied these issues over a number of years. That exchange of theories has always, I think, been useful in every administration in which I've served, and that will continue as long as there are experts willing to engage us, should continue. It's of great benefit to people inside the government. For the public at large, you know, I think one challenge is that there was a period in American life where these issues were at the very top of the agenda of public interest. I'm not sure if you can still say that. I'm not a pollster. I'm not someone who makes decisions in foreign policy based on exactly what public opinion surveys say. That said, I think if people are concerned about these issues, do place them on the list of things about which they vote and speak out about them, that will raise them up the agenda of people in Washington and in government as well, and they will be responsive to that. So hearing that from a broad swath of the public would make a difference.
All right. Why don't we end there? Please join me in thanking John Feiner for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Good to see you.
Please remain seated while John departs, and then we will make a transition to our next session. Thank you.
Do you want to move your chair over just
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Once again, I'm Daryl Kimball. I'm Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, and it's a pleasure to co-host this discussion and event with the good people at the Carnegie Nuclear Program, James Acton and company. We just heard a very meaty and detailed talk from Principal Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner on the administration's outlook on the WMD situation after 4 years in office. It is certainly a very complex picture. And this panel discussion with these four wonderful experts who've agreed to join us is going to focus on some of the issues that John Feiner touched upon. We're going to go into a little bit more depth. We're going to take another round of questions from the audience using the QR code. And we're going to be talking about future issues and implications for U.S. nuclear forces and posture as the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty expiration date approaches. And so what I'd just say to introduce this discussion and frame it is that, as John Feiner said, it's been more than a decade that we've seen deteriorating relations between the U.S., Russia, and China, dimming prospects for nuclear disarmament diplomacy, major nuclear weapons modernization efforts by China, Russia, and the United States, and we could soon be on the precipice of a dangerous, unconstrained three-way nuclear arms competition. And as he said, since February 2022, concerns about Russia's nuclear posture and its intentions have grown. Conversations with Russia on risk reduction and arms control have been suspended. And of course, we have China now on a steady and some would say fast buildup of its nuclear forces with unclear intentions and an unclear end to where it's headed. So in response, we've seen, as I mentioned in the conversation with John Feiner, proposals have been advanced in Congress and elsewhere to expand the scope and the cost of the already costly U.S. nuclear weapons modernization program, possibly to deploy more nuclear weapons on the existing systems or to build new nuclear weapons capabilities beyond those which we already have. Others, including those of us at the Arms Control Association, believe that adding more nuclear warheads on missiles, fielding more nuclear-capable bombers, or deploying more nuclear-armed cruise missiles does not enhance deterrence. This is not the way to go. And that if one side or the other, the U.S. or Russia, were to exceed new START limits, it would lead to a spiral of escalation. So as John Feiner said, these are issues that the next administration, the next Congress are going to have to grapple with. And so in this context, we have this fine group of folks to discuss some of these issues. On my left is Adam Mount, who's Senior Fellow with the Federation of American Scientists, Madeline Creedon, who served in several senior roles in government, including the aforementioned Congressional Commission on the U.S. Strategic Posture, and our co-host James Acton, co-director of the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Program. And so what I just wanted to ask this group to discuss, and we're going to start with Adam, is what are some of the factors that need to be considered as U.S. policymakers consider and debate the issue about how many nuclear weapons are enough, to put it bluntly. What are the assumptions that determine force requirements, deterrence requirements? Do they need to be adjusted? What increase in adversary capabilities would necessitate a change in the size or composition of the U.S. force? How much would that cost? How would adversaries respond? And where does such competition take us in the future? And are there any practical arms control measures in the near or medium term that can mitigate these risks? So these are some of the questions we're going to explore. Adam, why don't you give us a start on this? Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks to you, Daryl, and to James for having us here. I think it's crucially important that we have a more rigorous and more detailed conversation about these issues than we've had in public so far. Thanks in particular to for asking this question about interpreting the language in the Nuclear Employment Guidance public report. The reason why this is important, I think, is that the Biden administration has never clearly articulated an answer about what they believe would be required to meet the challenge from China's nuclear buildup. This is important because more than any other single issue, how the United States responds to China's buildup will set the shape and the mission of our U.S. nuclear arsenal for the balance of the century. Now, public reporting on the comments of administration officials has focused on the potential for a U.S. buildup. There have been times when current and then departing U.S. officials have suggested that some additions may be required in the future. In some cases, I think this focus from public reporting has been justified, in some cases not. But the central question here, which I've raised with Hans Christensen, my colleague, has been how to interpret this line that you mentioned in the Public Employment Guidance Report. It directed that the United States be able to deter Russia, China, and North Korea simultaneously. Now, many people, I think, will read this as meaning that the United States must be prepared to limit damage from multiple adversaries simultaneously. My reading is a little different, and I would have been grateful for a little more clarity on this. I think deter is a lower bar, like restore deterrence. And the president did not direct that the United States be prepared to limit damage from multiple adversaries simultaneously. What this would mean is that the upwards sort of pressure on US strategic deployed forces is relatively less. This is the first known US government answer to what's been called the two-peer problem. And unfortunately, I don't think it sets a clear expectation from the Biden administration and among US government agencies about what would be required to meet this challenge. And so it largely leaves that question to the incoming Trump administration. Now, this two-peer problem has become the dominant frame in nuclear weapons policy debates. Admiral Richard, a Livermore study group with high-level former senior officials, and the Strategic Posture Commission have all said that this two-peer problem presents a qualitatively different threat for the United States and its forces. Now, to understand this problem and to have a responsible debate about US options for responding to it, I think we have to redefine it far better than we have so far. It's become customary to note statistics about the scale of China's buildup, give anecdotes about Russia's highly alarming activities and doctrinal changes, falsely claim that the United States is stuck in neutral with its own armed forces, and then allow the reader to sort of infer the severity and the nature of the threat that it poses. I think we need to be clear about what exactly the problem is here. As I understand it, the two-peer problem is the claim that coordination between Russia and China poses a qualitatively different challenge for US nuclear policy that requires either a shift in strategy or force structure. On this definition, my reading is that there is no two-peer problem. There are several alarming facets of both countries, but there's no real reason why facing two adversaries at rough parity poses a risk to the United States and its strategy over and above the arsenals of each particular country. No study has articulated why US strategic forces are insufficient to maintain deterrence. The simple reason is that a Russian first strike could do unacceptable damage, undoubtedly, but cannot destroy reliably warheads on US submarines. Adding China's forces to the picture or doubling Russia's forces doesn't fundamentally change that calculation. Now, there are other examples where this two-peer dynamic could exacerbate other well-known problems in the arsenal. So, for example, a technological surprise that could cause the oceans to become transparent could create additional value for larger warhead sizes on the parts of adversaries. But here the problem is the technological shock rather than the two-peer problem itself. The second reason is the two-peer problem isn't really a problem for US nuclear forces. So the Strategic Posture Commission was very articulate on this problem of opportunistic aggression, the possibility of nuclear coercion in multiple theaters simultaneously. Here, I think the Biden administration's primary contribution has been this concept of integrated deterrence. My own work is focused on conventional deterrence of nuclear use, but they've been pretty creative about finding multiple ways that non-nuclear capabilities could contribute to deterrence of limited nuclear use. I think US nuclear forces are never going to be credible deterrents for limited fait accompli, rapid surprise attacks. And the flexible options currently in the arsenal are more than sufficient to respond or to deter any nuclear blackmail threat from US adversaries. The third reason is that the US is highly constrained in its ability to adapt its nuclear force structure in the near future. The Strategic Posture Commission, I think, helpfully provided a sense of the scale that would be necessary for a major buildup or major adaptations for US nuclear forces. I think we need a more rigorous and more careful conversation about whether that's plausible and whether that's necessary and what specifically is necessary to meet specific objectives in plausible scenarios. So Daryl, I thank you for initiating this conversation, and to my two panelist colleagues for starting this more rigorous conversation in the public.
Great, thank you very much, Adam. That's a great start. Let's turn to Madeline Creedon to offer your thoughts on some of these issues, and in particular, to elaborate more on some of the thinking behind your recent Foreign Affairs article with Frank Miller. That'd be very helpful. Madeline.
Thanks, Daryl, and again, thanks to James for hosting this. I mean, and also, I mean, I certainly agree with the various comments about the need to talk about this more. I mean, obviously there were 80-some recommendations in the Posture Commission, but one of them really was we have to talk about this more. We are in a situation that we haven't been in the past. We do have two peers in various ways that they're peers. Obviously, that's a longer discussion. But the whole geopolitical context, the threats that we are now as a nation facing, we haven't faced these ever. And we don't have the luxury of not addressing them and not talking about them anymore. And we also don't have the luxury, ironically, of just having one adversary to deter in the way we did with the Cold War. So as a result, we really have to give a lot of thought and a lot of analysis to what it really means to have this two-body problem, to have this two-peer problem. And that was one of the things that the Commission raised, talked about, and then the Biden administration in its recent nuclear employment guidance has addressed in terms of being able to deter simultaneously both Russia and China. And then they added North Korea as well, because obviously it is a growing threat, but also because of the cooperation, collusion, however you want to describe it, with Russia. And these developments really do pose far-reaching challenges to the United States and to the national security, and our national security, but also to that of our allies and partners. And so we really have to address these. We just don't have the luxury of ignoring this anymore. And so to address the new reality, particularly as John Feiner addressed in detail, the Biden administration modified U.S. nuclear targeting guidance in order to be able to deter, and again, I think you're right on this, Adam, the key here is deter China and Russia simultaneously. And then obviously we have to deter North Korea, but I think the driving force here really remains China and Russia. In many respects, I believe that I see that North Korea is what we used to refer to as China as this lesser included case. So I don't think the arsenal of North Korea will drive our overarching size and construct of our arsenal. But again, it too is developing new nuclear delivery systems, platforms, and warheads that pose a threat primarily to our allies in the region, but obviously also potentially to the U.S. But our real issue right now, I think the U.S.'s real issue, is the effort to modernize the aging U.S. nuclear deterrent. It's been hampered by a number of things, not the least of which was a late start, inadequate industrial base capacity, materials and labor shortages, and also some funding gaps. And so from the perspective particularly of that article that Frank Miller and I wrote, I think it's very clear what needs to be done. The next administration, in our view, really should dispense with undertaking a very extensive review of either the nuclear deterrence policy, which I think is sound and remains sound, or the modernization plans. Again, these are modernization plans that have been in place for quite some time. President Trump supported them the last go-around. President Obama supported them. President Biden has supported them. But we just need to get on with it. So I don't think there's a huge need to further analyze these modernization programs. We just need to get on with it. And while there may be some opportunities at the margins in the near term, the primary challenge is modernizing the nuclear complex across the board so that we do have options in the future when and if, and I think that's a big question, if the country needs them. And for what? And again, these are things that require a lot of analytical work into the future. The 6 tenets of nuclear strategy are sound: maintaining assured second strike, having a flexible response, being able to have having tailored deterrence, extended deterrence and assurance for our allies, calculated ambiguity, and hedging against risk. Those tenets are sound. Again, I don't think they need to be revisited or reanalyzed. But what does need to be discussed at this point is what do we need to do with our allies? What is going to continue to reassure our allies going forward? Are there things that we need to do to help assure them? And also, that assurance is important from a nonproliferation goal because we don't want an increase in the number of weapon states in the world, particularly amongst our allies. So the more that we can assure our allies and help them with their deterrence goals, it helps nonproliferation in the long term. Obviously, there's a huge challenge in our future with respect to Russia, and that's the expiration of New START. And the question is, what happens then? Ideally, it would be great if both Russia and the US could somehow agree to maintain the central limits of the treaty, even after the expiration of the treaty. It would be wonderful. I have to say, I don't see that as particularly hopeful. Maybe things will change and it will get achieved. But in any event, even if it were, it would obviously end up being an executive agreement of some sort to extend it, as I really don't see. I'm not optimistic about a new treaty being able to get through Congress anytime soon. And so for me, the real question, I think, is for the next administration is not a new NPR. It's not the years-long study. I think we fully understand the problem. We fully understand the modernization needs. But the analytic task that the next administration has to take on is, do we need more deployed systems? And if we need more deployed systems, what do we need them for? And if we need more deployed systems, and there's an analysis that we need them for a reason, then the other piece is, well, okay, how do we go about doing that? There's a very practical aspect to do this. What's needed? What's the funding? Where is it going to come from? Because it's going to happen over and above the ongoing modernization programs. Obviously, this is all the U.S. will be able to do in any relevant time frame, is to be able to increase the number of deployed forces, not the size of the arsenal. And the second analytical thing that I would like the next administration to take on, again, I don't feel the need for a full-blown NPR, and among other things, it's really not consistent with the urgency with which we have to get on with modernization. But the second thing is, I think this administration needs to tackle risk reduction. They may be in a better position to negotiate possibly with Russia and or China, or even if they reintroduce their concept of the trilateral discussions again, a serious look at what are the things that are possible with respect to risk reduction. I mean, obviously, right now, it's pretty, my word, hopeless. China has no interest, Russia has refused, and in fact, Russia's actions have gone beyond refusing with their new nuclear policy, which in some respects might actually lower the bar for nuclear use. And finally, with the unratifying of the CTBT, all of this has Russia moving in the opposite direction from risk reduction. So that would be my second assignment for the next administration, is to figure out, is there a way to get on with risk reduction? Thanks, Darryl.
Okay. James, if you could weigh in on this, and I would just note for those of you who don't read James as closely as I do, that James has argued that the United States should reassess some of the existing approaches to the issues that we've been discussing. So take it away, James, please.
Thanks, Darryl. I suppose if you're a nuclear wonk and you spent the last 15, 20 years thinking about nuclear weapons, it's really psychologically helpful if you think you're living at an important time. If you think it's a time when there's really impactful decisions being made and you want to believe that your work, is speaking to the moment. I really honestly believe that right now is a pivotally important time. Because I really believe that the decisions that the United States takes over the next few years, decisions that have started to be taken by the Biden administration, that I suspect will be taken by the Trump administration are going to catalyze a new arms race. And I think the big question facing the Trump administration is it a good idea for the United States to start a full-blown three-way arms race right now? You know, John Feiner in his remarks before talked about the need to prevent a new arms race. But an arms race is not something like a hurricane or a pandemic or a cyber attack that's, you know, happens to you and it's difficult to present. We can choose not to run an arms race. And the argument I'm going to make today is that we should choose not to run an arms race. And it really is as simple as that. Let me say firstly, I agree with John, I agree with Madeleine that the security environment is dangerous and getting worse. You're not going to hear any disagreement from me about that. The question is a buildup in US nuclear weapon numbers the right way to deal with that deteriorating security environment or not? And so much of the current discourse in DC treats as self-evident that if China and Russia are building up nuclear weapon numbers, we have to as well. If you listen to speeches by folks from the National Security Council, from the Department of Defense who have made this case, you will find literally not one sentence of explanation as to why more nuclear weapons in the United States will help to deter or combat threats from Russia or China. And this is where I respectfully disagree with Madeleine, who I think is one of the best, most informative thinkers on nuclear weapons, but I disagree with her that the tenets of US nuclear policy are sound. Because I think, you know, the one that she didn't mention is the idea of counterforce targeting. It is the idea, in extremis, of using our nuclear weapons to attack their, Russia or China, or Russia and China, or Russia and China and North Korea's, which pick your enemies, their nuclear forces. And the argument here is pretty straightforward. This is the argument that the Strategic Posture Commission, I think, got at. It's the argument you hear when you discuss with folks in government privately, that if Russia and China and North Korea have more nuclear weapons, we need more nuclear weapons so we can attack their nuclear forces individually or together. But the question is, what's the next stage in this argument? Okay, we'll build up more nuclear weapons in response to that. Do we think China and Russia go, oh, well, the US has got more nuclear weapons? It's not our problem that they're targeting our nuclear weapons with their nuclear forces. We're just going to give up and stick with our current plans. Or do we think it's more likely that they will adapt their plans in response to our buildup? And if they do adapt their plans in response to our buildup, then by the logic of attacking their nuclear forces, we need more nuclear weapons in response to that. And that is an arms race. And more than that, it's an arms race the United States is really badly positioned to run right now. If we had a massive defense industrial base for nuclear systems, and we could build up faster than them, maybe you could make an argument that an arms race was in the US interest right now. But their defense industrial bases for nuclear weapons are bigger and have more capacity than our defense industrial base for nuclear weapons. In short, if we start to build up and catalyze an arms race, it will be futile because they will build up, thus nullifying whatever advantage we sought. It will be expensive. And we will probably lose it at the end of the day. So for all of these reasons, I think it is simply a bad idea to start an arms race. But there's another one as well, which is a three-way arms race is much harder to stop than a two-way arms race. We arms raced against the Soviets during the first half of the Cold War. And about halfway through the Cold War, both sides were like, this was kind of futile. And they settled for parity. That wasn't primarily because of arms control. Arms control played an important reinforcing role. I think it was more actually that arms control was a consequence of being willing to settle for parity. But with three players, parity is no longer a mutually acceptable option for everyone. Would the Senate ratify a treaty that gave the United States as many nuclear weapons as Russia and China combined? Sure, that sounds like a pretty good deal from a US perspective. Would that deal be acceptable to Russia and China? I'm thinking probably not. What would be acceptable to Russia? Well, maybe a deal where it had as many nuclear weapons as the US. What would be acceptable to China? Well, a deal where it has as many nuclear weapons as the US. But that wouldn't be acceptable to us. So I think, once you start a three-way arms race, I don't see an easy way out of this. So for all of these reasons, my advice to the new administration is just don't do it. Right? It is literally, there are so many things in foreign policy and nuclear policy where factors are way beyond our control. But when it comes to choosing to arms race, this is a factor that we can just decide not to take part in. We can just choose not to do an arms race. Earlier in this administration, the Secretary of Defense said nuclear deterrence is not a numbers game. I wish DOD had actually listened to their leader, because he was 100% right about that. And my advice to the new administration is just don't start an arms race. It's not worth it. If we maintain a safe, secure, survivable, and reliable deterrent, we don't need to build more. Darryl.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Adam. We have a lot on the table here. We just have a couple of questions from the audience, so I would encourage those of you who have a thought, who are curious, please put in your questions here, and I will try to put them to our panelists. Let me just, a couple information notes for those who may not have heard this in the course of the comments. I think the Strategic Posture Commission noted this. Others have noted this. I mean, the way in which the United States could most easily and quickly increase the number of deployed nuclear weapons would be by uploading additional warheads on existing land-based and sea-based missiles. FAS did a helpful analysis about a year and a half ago that pointed out that both the United States and Russia have that capability. They could probably exercise it within 2 or 3 years and roughly double the number of strategic deployed nuclear weapons they have as of today. But beyond that, it would take new systems, new hardware. It would be much more expensive and much more time-consuming. But it could happen relatively quickly if each side were to decide to do that, one or the other side. And so, I mean, with that in mind, we've got a couple questions that directed to Madeline, but I wanted to ask James and Adam to address. So given the difficult threat environment, given the situation regarding Russia's unwillingness, so long as the war in Ukraine goes on, to engage with the U.S. on risk reduction, arms control, I mean, what serious risk reduction steps could the next administration take vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China? We've heard James mention, and I mentioned this, the possibility, Madeline, you mentioned this, a executive agreement that wouldn't require detailed negotiations between President Trump and President Putin to respect the New START limits. That's one option. But what other risk reduction options might be available to avoid the outcomes that James was outlining? And Madeline, why don't you start, and then Adam, and then maybe James.
Well, I mean, first, I want to make it very clear that the Strategic Posture Commission did not advocate for a new nuclear arms race. In fact, just the opposite. And the Strategic Posture Commission also made it very clear that what we need is more conventional forces to have deterrence from the outset, so that we never get into that military conflict that could then lead to nuclear use. So I just want to be clear that there's no advocacy for an arms race. And even in the article that Frank Miller and I just published, we said the United States need not and absolutely should not increase its nuclear arsenal to match that of Russia and China's combined. And then we endorsed the new guidance put out by the Biden administration, which we said, when fully implemented, will provide a strong and effective deterrent. So, and oh, by the way, we can't anytime soon engaged in a nuclear arms race. And that's the whole point. I mean, I completely agree. We should not engage in a new nuclear arms race. And our focus and our attention should be on continuing the modernization program, continuing the modernization of the complex, the defense industrial base, and that sort of thing. But back to the risk reduction question. So there are a number of things I think that possibly could be done. They're not arms control agreements. They don't look like arms control agreements. I would love that to be a path forward, and maybe it is in a couple years.
Arms control comes in many shapes and
It does.
sizes, yes.
But as a traditional arms control agreement. So for that reason, I think the focus on risk reduction is a better discussion, and that could include things like transparency. We haven't had a lot of luck in the past, but maybe we'll have some luck in the future. Maybe this is a way that you might be able to have some agreements with Russia even to maintain the central limits. Obviously, the treaty has expired, so you won't have the inspection provisions, but maybe there will be some opportunities for some transparency, even if it's mutual declarations of some sort. And maybe we have to look broader than nuclear weapons. I mean, maybe there are other things that we can look at. So I think the space is a good opportunity to have some discussions in terms of what is acceptable behavior in space. The U.S. has put forward the idea that many have adopted that we shouldn't do any sort of space anti-satellite nuclear weapons that generate debris in space, because every spacefaring nation is hurt by that. It's, debris doesn't discriminate. So it's those sorts of things. What are norms? Can we think of new norms that might be acceptable? I think the notifications, the agreement for notification on ICBM launches, that's great. It's those sorts of things that I think we need to start now. I mean, these little baby steps.
Okay. Adam, and as I turn this over to Adam, I mean, one thing we should also recall is that the Chinese are currently the chairs of the P5 process, the five-party mid-level discussions on nuclear postures and other matters. So that's a venue possibly for further discussions. Adam.
Thanks. I agree with Madeline that unfortunately I think there's very little prospect for a sort of bilateral or trilateral arms limitation agreement. I will note that John Feiner mentioned several steps that the administration has taken, especially with regard to China, that I think are constructive and helpful. China is becoming a little more flexible and a little more open, and moving towards, baby steps towards transparency about its intentions with its nuclear arsenal. One of the proposals that I would highlight from James's colleague, Tong Zhao, is about China's request for a dialogue on no first use. There will not be a bilateral no first use agreement, regardless of what you think of the proposal. But if it were up to me, I would take them up on the request. The reason is that's exactly the conversation that the United States has wanted for decades to have with China. A discussion about conditions for nuclear use and stability at the conventional nuclear threshold. They can call it what they want, as long as they're clear that it's not likely to lead to a bilateral agreement. The long-term answer for me is risk reduction, to reduce nuclear risk, reduce reliance on nuclear forces. And here I agree with the Strategic Posture Commission report that conventional deterrence is preferable in many ways. But the rest of the Strategic Posture Commission report includes sort of a laundry list of new systems and new ways to accelerate the modernization program that I think have the effect of increasing reliance on nuclear forces. What happens when we increase reliance on nuclear forces? And what happens when our adversaries do? When our adversaries increase reliance on nuclear forces, it increases the likelihood that they attempt nuclear coercion, especially in limited conflicts. When we do increase our reliance on nuclear forces, our allies believe it, become more alarmed, and unfortunately, I think it makes these nuclear coercion attempts more likely to succeed. My view is conventional deterrence is preferable, and if you can deny or halt an adversary advance with non-nuclear capabilities, it deprives them of any incentive to attempt nuclear coercion or to use nuclear weapons first. That's where I think the money should go. That's where I think the attention should go. And in my view, this sort of trend towards increased reliance on nuclear forces is the primary threat to deterrence in that regard.
And just one comment to that.
Yes.
So this is absolutely what the Posture Commission said, is that more conventional forces are needed, because in the absence of more conventional forces, in the absence of conventional deterrence, the U.S. will be forced to rely more, not less, on nuclear weapons. And that's not the goal, is to have the U.S. rely more. The goal is to have the U.S. rely less. And so that's why the conventional force modernization is paramount.
James?
I was going to start my response by saying nobody wants an arms race. And then I remembered that there was at least one senior official in the Trump administration first time round who said arms races are good and easy to win. So let me say, almost nobody wants an arms race. You know, I buy the point. I accept it. Nobody on the Strategic Posture Commission wanted an arms race. President Biden doesn't want an arms race. John Feiner doesn't want an arms race. Nobody wants an arms race. The point that I'm making is that, and this is a much bigger point than the Strategic Posture Commission, if you buy the premise of the US targeting adversaries' nuclear forces, which is not just something that was advocated or supported, I should say, by the Posture Commission, it's an intrinsic, long-standing part of US nuclear strategy. If you start from the premise that it's a good idea for the US to target adversaries' nuclear weapons and you get into a building up situation, I think an arms race becomes virtually inevitable at that point. So it's not a case of whether you're advocating for an arms race, it's whether the policies that you endorse and support will have the effect, perhaps unintended, of leading to an arms race. And as I argue, it will be a futile arms race that won't actually achieve your goal of a meaningful margin of superiority over the adversary. So, you know, look, I have to be honest with you. I think it's quite likely we're heading to this arms race, right? I don't think we can head it off at this point. But if we can, I do think the simplest agreement we could make, and I support this, and this is actually a lot more controversial than it sounds, is simply to agree with Russia that not to exceed the limits on New START after the treaty expires. Now that's controversial because it's not taking account of China. Certainly if President Biden had got that agreement, there would have been criticism left, right, well, criticism right of center, let me say, on whether or not, you know, that was on that being a bad agreement because it didn't involve China. My view is it is a good idea not to arms race with the Russians, irrespective of what the Chinese are doing. I fully agree with Madeline that realistically over the next few years, lowering the risk of escalation is the right way forward. So, you know, I don't think there's a ton of ideas that, you know, out there. I'm just kind of repeating what other people have said. I think launch notifications is a great idea. I think there's been a kind of informal start to that with the Chinese. I would love to see that continue. I think, you know, my own pet idea of in these very high altitude orbits that host nuclear command and control satellites, establishing safety zones so that satellites don't get too close to one another. Lots of technical details about how that would work, but that's the, you know, the kind of risk reduction measure that I think is a very good idea over the next few years.
All right, and just one additional point on a possible agreement between President Putin and Biden. As Tom Countryman, our Arms Control Association board chair, wrote in the current issue of Arms Control today, the aperture for dialogue between the US and Russia may widen if and when there are discussions about ending the conflict in Ukraine. So that could open up some options and make Russia a little bit more open to discussions on a wider range of issues that President Biden has not been able to pursue with the Russians. All right, we have time for just a couple of more questions, and I would just ask each of you to answer these as briefly as you can. One is on a topic that we've not touched upon yet, which is that, as we all know, the United States has not conducted a nuclear test explosion since September 1992, yet there are some, including President Trump's former national security advisor, who said we should resume nuclear testing. Your quick thoughts on whether this is really possibly on the agenda of the Trump administration or not, and what would the consequences be for some of the issues that we've just been discussing about geostrategic competition, arms racing, and the global nuclear order. So, Madeline, why don't you start, since you used to be in charge of this at the NNSA at one point and might know a thing or two or have an opinion.
So my personal is I certainly hope this is not on the agenda. If the new administration listens seriously to the laboratories and to the people who really do this work, who understand the stockpile stewardship program, the answer is no, it's simply not needed. And what is needed is to make sure that the science continues on, that the computational capabilities, the work out at Nevada for subcritical experiments, all of the work that the labs do continues on, because the price that would be paid, I think, is that we'd lose the science if we were to resume testing. And that's at least been my conversations with all the lab folks. That's not where they want to go.
Adam, James, quick thoughts?
Super quick. Yes, this is a real discussion. Yes, the resumption of nuclear testing is on the agenda. It's a terrible idea, but it's on the agenda. Here's my pitch as to why it's a bad idea. In fairness to many of the folks in the incoming administration, a lot of them are privately saying, we recognize there's no technical need for testing. We want to do it for political reasons. We think it's in the US interest to send out messages of our willingness to use nuclear weapons. My response to them is this: Russia and China don't have to worry about domestic politics. We have to worry about domestic politics in the United States. And if we get into a situation where we're all testing again, who do you think is going to test more? The country whose test site is in the middle of a swing state? Or the country whose test sites, the leaders don't care about what the people around the test sites think? Let me leave you with that.
All right. Anything to add, Adam?
Agreed.
Okay, great. All right, last question that I'd ask each of you to address. We're here in Washington. We've been talking a lot about the United States and ourselves, but we have a global audience, and nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war is an issue that matters for the globe, and it has implications for global security, of course. So, what role can or should other governments, non-nuclear weapon states, U.S. allies, what should they play, what could they play in this debate about whether the United States, Russia, and China should or should not enter into an unconstrained arms race? What kind of influence might our European allies have on some of the issues we've been discussing? And I would note that all 5 of the nuclear armed states that are part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty have an obligation under Article 6 to engage in good faith negotiations to end the arms race and on disarmament. So with that, your thoughts, why don't we start in reverse order, and we'll start with James and come back this way.
Sure. Very briefly, look, I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think allies can or would say to the United States, arms control is in the US interest or not in the US interest. I think what allies can and should say is, we view preventing an arms race as being in our interest. It's up to you, the United States, to decide what your interests are. But we, your allies, have a strong interest in there being the absence of an arms race, in there being a reduced risk of nuclear war. And I think, I would encourage allies to talk clearly and honestly about how you perceive your interests, given very explicitly that the purpose of the US nuclear arsenal includes extended deterrence, includes enhancing the security of allies. And so I think it's helpful for allies to think about what's in their interest and being willing to communicate that to the US.
Anyway, so I agree with the fact that it's hard to believe that allies would think that an arms race is in their interest. So for what they can do, obviously this whole topic is a much larger topic for a much larger discussion. But I think among other things, allies, we need to bring allies closer in terms of our thinking and our planning, particularly on the conventional front. We need to bring allies closer in terms of our thinking and planning with respect to integrated deterrence. And I think there's a lot more that allies can do on the conventional side. And we need to work more closely with them to make sure that this conventional planning, the conventional capabilities are understood, they're broader, and they're more closely coordinated.
Adam.
I really couldn't agree more. The other unfortunate implication of sort of gradually increasing reliance on nuclear weapons, I think, is that it also increases proliferation risk. One of the sort of stated missions of the US nuclear arsenal is to reduce proliferation pressure by assuring allies. I think this often has a perverse effect where we increase our perceived reliance on our nuclear forces. We convince allies that their security depends on nuclear weapons, which I think is often false. It's our conventional forces that really serve as the cornerstone of our deterrent posture. But then, as they grow more uncertain about US leadership, or they have questions about when and why the United States would use a nuclear weapon, the inevitable inevitable sort of consequences, well, eventually we'll need our own. And so future US administrations are going to, I think, face, unfortunately, some very acute pressures for nuclear proliferation among US allies in Asia, in the Middle East, and even some sort of rumblings in Europe. And that's a deeper conversation that has to be had. I think the first step is exactly what you mentioned, is to prioritize the strength of our conventional capabilities.
Well, this is certainly, as James said, a critical time. A lot of critical questions need to be answered in the right way to make sure that we're headed towards a safer and not a less safe future. We've just begun to delve into some of the questions that we're going to be debating over the next several months, if not much longer. I really appreciate collaborating with James and the Carnegie team. I want to thank Madeline for joining us and her work through the years, and for the thoughtful contributions with the Strategic Posture Commission report, and Adam also for joining us and providing a lot of important perspective on the issues that are behind these decisions. We will have a recording of this, I think, on the Carnegie Endowment website soon. Our friends at C-SPAN have also been recording us. Thank you to our C-SPAN audience. Please join me in thanking our panelists and the team.
Thank you.
And I hope to see many of you at the Carnegie Endowment's annual conference on nonproliferation issues in April. Please be sure to take a look at that and look for more information on the Arms Control Association website and Arms Control Today at armscontrol.org. Thanks all, we're adjourned.
Thanks. Thank you.